Us. Thanks for coming. Mitch, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for letting me.
We're just doing a Q&A today. I just thought quite often some people have some questions about different things and we don't get an opportunity to answer them to any degree. And the other thing too is that it's been a big couple of weeks, a big week at least, doing a lot of classes today. I've got my third class coming up. So it's good to have a bit of a physical rest, I think.
Yes.
Mitch has been helping me by taking portions of the class and everything like that. But anyway, today we're just going to start off with some Q&A. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free to come on board and type in your questions. And if we have an answer, we'll answer it. Hi, Rochelle. Good to see you coming along. Rochelle's very loyal to our consistency, yeah.
Which is great. So, Shin, I've got a question to kick off with. When it comes to Shingi Tai, the spiritual part, it's also said, is from India. The technical part is from China of karate, and then the physical from Japan, Okinawa. And you've taken your study in the spiritual part, I think, from my observations anyway, quite deeply. So what drew you to go down the part of your spiritual and religious studies, and how important do you believe they are to karate and to karate practitioners who may not spend as much time in that area in their own study?
Yeah, well, look, I think at the end of the day, and I'm just going to dig up a quote here. I'm just doing this quote, and there's a very famous quote which I put in my book as well from an Indian spiritual teacher named Yukteswar. And he wrote a book, a fascinating book, one of the most incredible books. He wrote it in 1894. It was called The Holy Science. Basically what he did was point out kind of a roadmap of where the world was going to go. And in 1894, he predicted in the book the discovery of all kinds of scientific things, radio waves and all this. And he said in that book that when man becomes a little enlightened, he compares his experiences in daily life to his experiences in the dream state. Okay, so when you're having a dream, whilst you're in that dream, you don't know that it's not real. It's very rare. So you do get to a point, maybe that you go, well, actually, this is just a dream. But generally speaking, when you're in the middle of the dream, it's as real to you as your day-to-day experiences. So what happens is you get to a point where one day you start to question that. And you know that your experiences in the dream state are essentially just ideas, just figments of your imagination. So therefore, you begin to question the veracity, the reality of your experiences in the waking state. If the dream state experiences aren't real, well, then maybe the experiences in your daily life aren't real. Okay, and then what happens is, the actual words that Sri Yukteswar used was, the heart then becomes propelled to know the real nature of the universe, and struggling to clear your doubts, you seek for evidence to determine what is truth. Okay? And in that state, man is what's known as kshatriya, or a warrior. There are 4 classes in India, and the warrior class is known as the kshatriya class. So, in other words, what happens is you get to a point, everyone gets to a point where they start to entertain doubts as to the essential reality of their experiences in day-to-day life. Then you become propelled. You can't help it. Then your life becomes driven to find answers. And in that state, you become a warrior. Okay? And I think what happened was quite early, I can remember looking for answers pretty early, trying to find a solution to that. And that's all it really is. And then I think everybody goes through that. And then you have the poem, that famous poem, which I also wrote in my book, by Walt Whitman, And if you have a look at his book, Leaves of Grass, it's the only book he ever wrote, although over the years it expanded. And the very first poem in that is called As I Pondered in Silence. And what it is, it describes a scenario where, and remember, he was in the 19th century, so he didn't have electric lights. So he's talking about a poet pondering in silence. As I pondered in silence, returning upon my poems, considering, lingering long. And he says, so in other words, he's the poet and he's writing poems. And then a phantom rose before me. And the phantom was the ghost of all the poets that had ever lived. And it directed, it said, and he says, and it was the genius of all the poets. And he says to him, what are you writing about? And he says, don't you know that all the poems of all the poets who ever lived about one theme, and that is the theme of war, the fortune of battles, and the making of perfect soldiers. In other words, what he's saying is, don't you know that every poem ever written is all about that nature of us becoming a warrior? Because becoming a warrior, you're fighting a battle, and the battle, we've spoken about this before, where's the battle? Well, the battle's inside. And even the breath state between, it's a battle between carbon dioxide and oxygen, you know. So every breath you take is essentially the smallest war that's going on, the battle that's going on. So the essential nature of mankind is to rise to a point where you become a warrior. Okay? And it doesn't, I don't just mean the warrior who actually goes off to war, that's one type of warrior, but in the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavad Gita is the Indian scripture that describes a conversation between Krishna and his student Arjuna on the battlefield of life. And the battlefield of life is what this whole Bhagavad Gita is about. So anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to a very simple question. But essentially, I think what happened was at some stage, I just felt like I wanted to know more about what was going on, you know? So that's I think, everyone gets to a point, whether it's in this life or another one, where they go, you know, there's got to be more to it. There's got to be more to life than just waking up, using my intellect to make money, and then going back to bed again, you know? Yes. And you can say, well, you know, there's more to it. It's just joy. You have fun and all that. Well, no, even fun comes to an end at some stage.
Yeah, and you've talked about that before, how anything that has a beginning and has an end is a form of suffering, right?
Well, that's a Buddhist
philosophy.
Buddhist philosophy that says everything is suffering, in that if something has a beginning, it has an ending. And the nature of the ending is, in a small, subtle way, there's a degree of suffering. So that in one respect, the goal of life is to learn to equilibrate all that, to reduce the fluctuations so that, you know,
the phenomenal world.
Yeah, that beautiful quote,
beware the
inevitable fluctuations beware of the emotional reactions,
the inevitable fluctuations of the phenomenal world.
We'll get that. We'll edit that out. Yeah. Beware of the emotional reactions to the inevitable fluctuations of the phenomenal world. So the phenomenal world is just the world of happy, glad, sad, mad, sunshine, dark, day, night, cold, warm. Whatever you have is mathematically balanced with an equal opposite. And so the way to reduce the pain is to reduce the desire for intense pleasure and just overcome the emotional reaction to it. You've done the 100. Good on you. So anyway, I think, and you mentioned Shingi Tai. Well, I think that's a really interesting thing because, and Sensei Mike turns up right there. Sensei Mike, as you may know, wrote that beautiful book called Shingi Tai, which describes Shin, the mind, Gi, the technique, Tai, the body. And Sosai pointed out that essentially in the martial arts, or in Japanese karate as we know it, Shin, the mind, in other words, the philosophy, the Buddhist philosophy, and the Zen philosophy, and also the breathing techniques the breathing techniques which we do in karate, they all find their origin in India. Gi, or the waza, the techniques, essentially, as you know, that the early Okinawan masters, including Miyagi Chojun, who was the teacher of Sosai's teacher, and Miyagi Chojun's teacher, went to China and studied the Chinese techniques. So fundamentally, the techniques which we use in karate find their origin in China. And it's in China that the martial arts techniques, as we know them, were probably most developed. And then Thai, or the physical conditioning version, well, that varies all over the world, as you know. The Western paradigm for the physically strong man is the V shape, whereas in India the paradigm is more an O shape with powerful thighs and powerful legs. You look at the sumo wrestlers and you get an idea of how strong a Japanese version of a man is. So the physical conditioning that we use in karate is based on a lot of leg work. Probably more leg work than an average of the Western idea. Yeah. So that's really very interesting. I love that concept, and you can take that to any degree that you want. What's the question? Do you think there may be a time in the future that high contact competitive, do you mean competitive sports, may be limited or restricted because of the effect of CTE? Yes and no. I think we're already seeing the effect of CTE in a lot of contact sports, particularly, first of all, American football, because they wear helmets. And ironically, you put a helmet on, you get more CTE because you think you're impervious.
Yeah.
You think you're impervious to the dangers of it. You use your head, but helmets don't protect the brain. The nature of the human brain is that it's very different to animals that, like goats and rams, that headbutt. That the way their brain in their head is protected is very different to ours. So our brain isn't built for contact. So you take the helmet off, and the first thing you learn to do is protect your head. But even without the helmet, footy players in rugby league and rugby union, and even soccer players who do a lot of headers, they're finding that they do get levels of CTE. CTE, for those who aren't sure, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is the brain, the punch-drunk syndrome, or the effect of impact on the brain. Unfortunately, with it is quite debilitating, and it does deteriorate over time.
Yeah.
So the beauty of, for example, there's one of the lovely reasons that I like Kyokushin style fighting. They say, well, you don't punch to the head. Well, I mean, there may be a drawback in some respects, but there's a strength to it too, in that it protects the brain from excessive CTE. You don't get a lot of impact. One, the rules of the tournament is you get a good head kick and you get knocked out, that's it. And probably you won't be fighting a tournament for another 3 to 6 months or even a year, okay? But the chances of being hit in the head are much lower because the legs take much longer to come. Of course, some guys are just so good at it. And when you do get whacked, you get whacked. But the difference is you get a boxer or a kickboxer, they'll get as many shots in the head in one training session that a Kyokushin fighter might get in
whole tournament career.
Yeah, in a tournament career. Okay, so I think in that respect, Kyokushin protects you from the CTE. The other thing too is they put head guards on and the gloves, and that all has, to a degree, some protective effect, but it's still
rattling the brain as you get rocked.
That's why in the early days CTE was known as the punch-drunk syndrome, because, and gloves back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s were just, they were padded with like straw, really. So, the effect on the brain was pretty solid. And, the fact is it just keeps deteriorating over time. So I think you look at UFC, for example, and if the referee's on point, well, then there's less impact to the brain, especially where you have the chokes. And there's a whole range of techniques. And the smaller gloves, ironically, means probably you get hit less in the head. Possibly.
They take less, yeah.
Yes, they take less blows. You could be right. I think it just depends where the future, I mean, if it was a left-wing woke future, then maybe they'd cut out all sport that involved anything more than a pat on the shoulder, you know. But the fact of the matter is that impact sports exist. It's a very solid, strong thing to do. And I can't see in the near future anyway them curbing it. I think if anything, what they'll do is that the methods of training will change so that we can learn to protect the head better.
There's already more protocol, Shihan. In certain colleges in the US, for example, Marco, they let the athletes train X amount of hours. That's all the coaches will get them for now. So there are protocols in place. If someone does get concussed or anything like that, they're out for periods of time. We see that more now in combat sports as well. In rugby league here in Australia, we see in the NRL, which is leading the way in concussions and knocks on the field. They'll come off, they'll have to do some sort of test. And if they don't pass the test, they're not allowed back on the field. They don't play the following week and so on. So they're more reactive. Like, that's probably a more reactive response, but I think it's a very good one in the heat of the battle, because there's more and more sports people coming out who used to play in the rough and tough days, who have got CTE-like effects and PTSD and different types of conditions, who are worse for wear for it. But there's more and more protocols will come out, I think, to minimise the likelihood of it. And as Shihan said, politically, sadly, I do think that does have an impact on the direction that things will go. But I know from a combat point of view, if it ever happened, things will just go underground as well, as they always have. So I can see that happening as well.
And there's one interesting thing that, Marco, you brought up CTE. That's really fascinating, because I looked into that. And I just typed in a word, glutathione. Glutathione's, it's funny, it's probably the most important antioxidant in the body, protective antioxidant in the body. It's a tripeptide. We don't know a lot about it, but what we do know is there is a whole range of different protocols. Even I saw there's a famous doctor in America has come up with a series of protocols, or a protocol to deal with the effects of the COVID vaccine. For some people, it's quite debilitating. And he's come up with a protocol. And his protocol includes whether it's, I don't think it's oral.
No.
It'd be IV N-acetylcysteine, or NAC.
Yeah.
Now, I could talk to you about glutathione all day. To me, it's the most important antioxidant. It's a tripeptide, and of the three peptides, cysteine is the limiting factor. So as you know, anything is only as strong as the weakest link. So as a tripeptide, the other two peptides are in abundance. Then the body, it's endogenous, so the body manufactures its own glutathione. The problem is it can only manufacture as much as the cysteine is available, and cysteine runs out very quickly. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because very early on, there were some people doing research on mice. And as you know, we do a lot of research on mice because the system is surprisingly similar to the human system in terms of the chemistry and so on. And what these people were doing, they wanted to look at brain waves whilst the brain was still alive in the mouse. So what they were doing was they were anesthetizing mice and very subtly scraping away the skull so that the skull was so thin they could see the brain. But whilst they were doing that, that became a form of CTE, right? It's affecting the skull and the brain. And they noticed something really interesting in that the mice were flooding the area of injury with as much glutathione as they could possibly manufacture. Now, the thing about endogenous glutathione, the body will manufacture it and send it to where it's needed. So if you get a whack on the head, if you are able to analyze the chemistry, you'll find that at that site, the body will just flood it with glutathione to overcome the problem. The problem is cysteine runs out almost immediately, so it's a very slow process. It can't produce more glutathione, okay? So the limiting factor being cysteine is they try to work out ways to increase that cysteine level. Now, The primary solution that is found today is IV NAC, N-acetylcysteine, to form a cysteine. They'll even give that when someone overdoses on Panadol. The first thing they do in the hospital is try to give them cysteine. Why? Because the body deals with the Panadol, the Panadol, that the acetaminophen poisons the liver, and it's the liver that dies, which kills the body. So by hitting with cysteine, it allows the body to produce more and more glutathione. The problem is when it's done IV, it doesn't allow the body to manufacture it in a way that optimizes its availability in the liver. Okay, and the only thing I've ever seen, there's a doctor in America, I think his name's Nagasawa. He was like a Hawaiian Japanese. Nagasawa, I think. Herb Nagasawa. I'll have to look him up. But when they had those, remember they had those letter poisoning where they had the white powder. What was that white powder that was being sent to government offices and people would open the envelope?
I heard about that. Yeah, I'm not sure. I couldn't say.
It was, what's the name of that poisonous white powder? But anyway, the US government put a mandate out to research scientists to try what they called the 3-minute solution to that. I can't believe I've forgotten what that, if anyone knows what that white powder is called, that you breathe it and it kills you. And this Herb Nagasawa, I think his name was, he was the only one that could come up with what they called, not ricin, no. It'll come to me. It's not ricin though. But Herb Nagasawa came up with the 3-minute solution. He's the only scientist in the world that was able to come up with it. And his solution was, because if you take glutathione orally, it doesn't survive. It doesn't get past the acid line in the gut. Okay, so if you see glutathione tablets, don't waste your time. It's just a waste of money because it gets destroyed in the gut. But he worked out a way to produce, to allow the body to introduce cysteine. He called it ribosine. He created a molecule called ribosine. What he did is he took the cysteine molecule and coated it in ribose, which is a sugar.
Yep.
And that allowed it, the ribose was affected by the gut, but it would get through the stomach acids into the gut as cysteine and would allow the body then to optimize production of glutathione. It was a brilliant thing. He should have got a Nobel Prize.
He still may, who knows in the future.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that's, so in terms of CTE, I think if they can find a way to maximally optimize glutathione production in the body, I think that's one solution that they could find. If the body has optimal amounts of glutathione, it can deal with that impact almost immediately. Another interesting thing is that I have a little bottle in my fridge at home, which is it's nothing but capsules of the ribosine molecule. And I had a doctor that told me the best thing you can do if someone overdoses, like even, I don't mean they take 20 Panadol, sometimes you can just take 7 or 8 and it's too many. And one of the best things you can do is this doctor told me, if you have this ribosine, you keep taking a ribosine tablet about every 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And that allows the body to keep producing glutathione. Right. Whether it works or not, I'm not a doctor, but the point is glutathione production, if you can find ways to work out how to optimize your body's it's an antioxidant which is probably 10,000 times more potent than vitamin C, and vitamin C has won 2 Nobel Prizes.
Yeah, incredible effects.
Yeah. So anyway, that was interesting. Back to the kata question. Some of our Kyokushin kata are quite different to their Goju Shotokan counterparts. Example, Seipai, Yokogeri, Maegeri, and jump in Pin and Sam. Why? Athleticism. What's the Bunkai? Okay, good. So first of all, Bunkai. Thanks for the question, Mark. Bunkai, it's very hard to describe Bunkai whilst we're sitting in a couple of chairs. But Bunkai, there's 2 approaches to Bunkai. there's what they call en-eki-ho and kino-ho. En-eki-ho is inductive reasoning. Kino-ho is deductive reasoning, or around the wrong way. So en-eki-ho is deductive reasoning. So what that means is you look at a technique in the kata and you go from the technique back to the possible scenarios that it can present, and you create applications from it. The opposite, inductive reasoning, in Japanese is called kino-ho. And kino-ho says, all right, well, you don't look at the technique, but you look at the situation that presents itself and find a technique that works. Okay, so you may say, for example, let's look at Pinan 2, Pinan 4, they're my favorites, Kunku. We have this technique, okay? So deductive says you look at that technique, you go, well, what are the different scenarios that I can apply the technique? The opposite to that is we are presented with a scenario, what techniques can I use there? And you might find that that technique applies in some places, but something else applies somewhere else. It's very difficult to imagine that you can change on the run, but you can reduce the number of variables down so that you have a realistic application to it. Okay, so I think there are a lot of differences, just as from style to style, there are variations. Even you look at difference between Shotokan and Goju. Now, there's two reasons for that. One may be that instructors had their own ideas about it and taught the technique slightly differently. Another one may be that people change the technique deliberately to try to create a sense of originality. I see a lot of that in Kyokushin, especially after Sosai, as it's split up. Some people change the kata slightly to try and add their own originality to it. I've got no problem with that, because particularly if the people who are creating those changes are doing it intelligently and they're highly experienced martial artists, well, they have their own body of experience that they're allowed to apply. So there's no problem with that. From my viewpoint, from what I've seen in my research, I see that a lot of the differences are really, really good. And they become good if you know both. So it may be, for example, that the technique, at the most simple variation I can see, even amongst Kyokushin groups, is Taikyoku-ichi, you block down, and I leave my hand down in Gedanbare as I step through with a punch. Whereas other groups may be blocked down, then the arm comes up as you step through. And some people go, well, yeah, you know, there's no sense. I find both of them have incredible practicality and incredible reasons for doing that. So both of them are as equally valuable. So, Mark, so from what I can see, I like the idea, like in my own dojo, I'll say to them, sometimes it's done this way, sometimes it's done that way. You analyze it, take it away for the next 15, 20 minutes, and you play with it, and you come up, you tell me why you think that those two exist. And you'd be surprised how students come up with really good solutions to it. The other thing too is that as long as the variation has intelligence, then I have no problem with it at all. I think this is really, really important actually for Kyokushin, because any martial art that doesn't grow dies. Stagnation is death. And there's the old adage where I think it was Don Drager or some famous martial art master was doing something in the Kodokan Judo, and one of the instructors is watching. Then when he finished, he walked over and said, "That's really interesting. Why do you do it like that?" And whoever it was said, "Well, that's the way I was taught.
I've always done it."
Yeah. And he goes, "Oh, I thought you were a lot smarter than that." So in other words, when you're in someone's class, you pay respect and you do it their way. But when you do your own training, you have to question everything. Question everything. And by questioning everything, then you start to see that rather than go, well, we do it that way, the way you do it is wrong. Go, that's interesting. Let me see, why do you do it like that? And what can I come up with? What solution can I come up with based on my own experience that gives credence to that way of doing it? So I think you'll always find variations, Mark, and I think even within Kyokushin you have so many variations. You look at the difference between Shotokan, Goju, Wadoryu, Kyokushin. They're all essentially like Shitoryu, for example, is from the instructors who had trained in different styles, and all of them become slightly different. So that's why if you look at the Karate Federation, when they have international kata competition, in fact, they end up creating competition kata which is suitable for all the different styles. So it's crazy. So they've actually made another kata almost for all the styles to be able to compete to do that one kata. So if you're in Shotokan, you learn your Shotokan way of doing it. If you want to compete in kata contests, you have to learn a slightly different way of doing it. So there's benefits and drawbacks in that. But anyway, fair question, I think. BJJ Fanatics, Black Belt Ryan. Thank you for coming, Ryan. We're big fans of BJJ Fanatics. Oh, snap, much love, you guys. I'm a lifetime martial artist. We've gained so much from your channel. I started with Shotokan and then got into Jiu-Jitsu. Good on you. I think you didn't ask a question. Oh, here we go. I'd love to talk about the things like the illusion of separation between the Japanese samurai arts, the stances, front stand, back stand, that you see in Hickson's self-defense instruction, etc. Okay, so first of all, I think the words you use there, the illusion of separation, is really cool.
Yeah.
Because there is no separation. We talk about it all the time. My theory is there is only one martial art. And the thing that separates all the different styles of training is the rules that you choose to train under. Because the reality is, if I had to protect my family from someone who was trying to violate or kill them, I would use everything from every martial art. I wouldn't limit myself to a range of techniques. And I know from my experience, and you've done stand-up as well as grappling, so you know that there's nothing complete. You may argue, some people may argue that one martial art or another is complete, but it's not. We know that from UFC. We see that once people learn to adopt techniques from all the different ranges, they become much more difficult to defeat because they have more options. We talked about Hick's Law today. As you know, Hick's Law is a military axiom which said for every given choice you have in a situation, for every alternate choice you have, you increase your reaction timing. Well, when you're flying an F-35 at Mach 2 and you have a choice of doing one thing or the other, but you have a millisecond to make that decision, then it makes sense to me that having more than one way could cause a slowdown in reaction timing. When you stand up fighting, say boxing, something like that, you have a little more time, but still, even there, under a circumstance, you will react very predictably because you don't have time to think of it. In BJJ, it's different again because you have a month of Sundays to work out. You do something, you go, oh, that didn't work. You pull your arm back out and you drop your elbow and you have more time in BJJ to do everything because it's the slowest martial art in the world.
And you want to have options there as well, because in BJJ or grappling, if you've only got one option and it doesn't work, you're in a lot of trouble. But we know many roads lead to Rome, so you can have more options and take more time because that aspect of that range of fighting is genuinely slower.
Yeah. So, and my friend Nick Hughes pointed out that whilst Hick's Law might be valid, I'd rather have more alternatives to back me up in a situation when my primary go-to didn't work anymore. So lately we've been working on knee right escapes. Well, where's the knee? Is it here? Each of those knee rides will almost demand a slightly different reaction. And if you have a particular way of escaping the knee ride, some people have a particular way of countering that. So you have to arm yourself with more than one way to do things. I think that's really important. So the notion, I think unarmed combat arts initially were all called taijutsu. Tai means the body, so all they meant were the body arts. And there was no distinction. And then what happened is there was a formulation and an organization of techniques which became essentially known as Aiki Jiu-Jitsu. And then from Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, you had separation of training methods according to different people's preferences. So you went into the joint locks, joint breaks, you went into the throwdowns, you went into, and that was influenced by sumo as well. Even sumo became part of the taijutsu. Then other people preferred to go, yeah, well, why should I choke him out? But I'm just going to thumb him in the eye and bite his neck. And so there was other, and someone said, yeah, but I got a knife. I'm just going to end it. So you had separation of the training systems based on the preferences of individuals. So what was once a complete system, then separated according to the rule sets. There's nothing wrong with doing what clearly you've done, Ryan, is you combine the stand-up and the grappling and into what I call the 5 ranges, because I have a saying, each range trumps the range before it. So if you're a kicker, if you're fighting a kicker, for crying out loud, don't hang around kick range.
Yeah.
You get inside the kick range to the punch range. If you're fighting a boxer, what happens when boxers get whacked? First thing they do is they get into the clinch range, okay? From the clinch range, you have headbutts and elbows. Well, how am I going to shut that down? You get even closer to the stand-up grapple range, and then from there, you take them to the ground and you're on the ground. And each of those ranges trumps the range before it. And then if you're on the ground, what do? If you want to avoid being armbarred and choked out by a good grappler, you create space, stand back up and kick them. So the circle is complete. So you have those 5 ranges. And I think being ignorant, Sorsai said, to call yourself a martial artist, you must be familiar with the fundamentals of all the different fighting arts. So that's why he traveled a lot and he experienced all these different things. Anyone who's never done at least some training in Muay Thai is in big trouble if they fight a Muay Thai fighter, because they're so good at what they do. But even a Muay Thai fighter, if he gets taken to the ground, has no solution to a good BJJ black belt. And in my dojo, in Kyokushin, as a general rule, it's not hard and fast, but as a general rule, and Mitch is an example, Aaron, Damon, Sean, Farzan's heading there, Ben. We like guys, if they're going to get their black belt in Kyokushin, to be at least a good blue belt in BJJ. Because as you know, Ryan, if you've got a blue belt in BJJ, you can out-grapple pretty well anyone who's never grappled before, because a good blue belt has had so much experience on the mat. Okay, so the wording you use, the illusion of separation, is really nice. The stances, I think you have static and mobile stances. In our karate, we treat stances in terms of where the body weight is centered. And an interesting thing, Ryan, is that I experiment a lot with karate stances in different situations in BJJ, and I find that stand up against open guard, different things, waiter sweeps, even De La Rivas, spider guard and everything. A good karate Sanshin stance is very difficult to break. It gives you very strong solidity in that stance. So anyway, that's I hope that kind of touched upon what you were talking about there, Ryan, and I appreciate you coming along. Soledad, adios. How are you, my friend? I've always been puzzled as to why Kyokushin karate, some groups, for some of the katas, some movements are slightly different, wondering how and why that did come about. Okay, well, as I said previously, the cynic in me says that sometimes people make changes just for the sake of change. And I think this is what happened when the Matsui group kind of went on and did their own thing, and they became very strongly influenced by the way particularly Saiko Shihan, Shigeru Oyama was doing things which was slightly different again. So I think some groups change the technique just enough so that they can tell if someone is from a different group. There's those changes. On the other hand, I think sometimes, and again, I'm being very cynical and I could mention names, but I won't, but I think in Japan over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, most strong Kyokushin guys were focused on one thing, and that was tournament fighting. So their kata suffered, and they weren't really particularly good at kata. And I know when I did my second dan grading at Hombu in 1984, I had guys asking me questions because the only time they did kata was for their gradings. So they weren't particularly authoritative about kata. That's changed since Sosai died because now all of a sudden they realize the Western world wants to know more about kata, and they start to see value because when I analyzed the techniques that Sosai taught, only 27%, 28% of the techniques that Sosai taught were applicable to tournament fighting. The other 72% were techniques that you couldn't use in tournaments, which meant joint locks, throws, breaks, techniques, illegal techniques. So all these techniques, what happens to them? Well, when you retire from tournament fighting, all of a sudden you become interested in kata. Kata presents a beautiful training system that allows you, if you have a brain, if you have a good deductive brain, you can start to, okay, well, what is this? How can I use this? Oh, yeah, that's really good. Bang. Oh, yeah. And then you start to take those traditional techniques and apply them to realistic scenarios against non-compliant opponents. You bridge that gap. You find the reality of it. And so this is why you start to see variations in the techniques because different people go, well, you know, in that technique, I really like. So you look, for example, you go to, I think it's Shitoryu. When we might turn in one of the kata with uchiuke, and our uchiuke, the fist is shoulder height. When they turn with uchiuke, the fist is up here with the arm horizontal. Well, isn't that interesting? Because if Mitch throws a technique at me and I block, look, if I do with my wrist at the height of Kyokushin, that's all very good. But what if he does this and now I've got to lift my hand up? So we find that when we use practical application in the kata, when that technique comes, I will automatically, look, raise my hand to a height which is closer to Shitoryu. So Shitoryu goes, well, if you do that in reality, why don't we do it in the kata? Okay, so this is where variations come in because different people have different viewpoints based on their training experience. And the only thing that counts in training is your own experience. I believe that very strongly. Todd, also thanks for coming. In the beginning, kata wada we ibuki breathing. There's tradition as well. You know, we have in karate we have traditions, and by preserving these traditions, we preserve a continuity of teaching style, and you can go anywhere. Ibuki, I think, is a form of yoga breathing, and there's you could open up a whole Pandora's box of discussion when you talk about the different breathing. But you have ibuki breathing, you have nogare breathing, nogare 1, nogare 2, all these different things. And the reason we'll do ibuki breathing is simply, I believe, one, to develop the ibuki breath, and the ibuki breath has applications which are kind of spooky almost, in that you do that ibuki breath and it's a Shin Toitsu, they call it in Japanese, Shin Toitsu. It anchors the mind and body together, and it calms the mind down under stress in a very dangerous situation. So that's one of the reasons we use breath. We use breath in all kinds of ways. As you know, even if you go to a anger management, they'll tell you, you know, take a breath and count to 10. Get you, you know, that's another example of it. You know, my grief counselor. My grief counselor died very suddenly just recently. But fortunately, she was so good at her job, I didn't even care. But anyway, that's another thing. All right, so the breathing, I think, Todd, one of the reasons we do ibuki breathing is, and again, the cynic in me says that most people can't do ibuki properly, just the same as most people who do yoga don't do the yoga breathing properly. You're about to say something.
I was just going to say, in your book, you mention a passage from Solsai, and he says words to the effect of someone who can control their breath properly can handle fire in their strides and still remain calm, essentially. So he's mean the world's burning around you, but you're in control, you're present, you're focused. And I think that's such a great analogy.
Yeah, and if you look at yoga, you look at the Yoga Sutras, essentially, the Yoga Sutra says, well, here's an explanation of yoga. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. So in other words, in karate, we call mushin, the state of no mind, where, you know, remember that scene out of Tom Cruise's Last Samurai. He says, please forgive too many minds. And he goes, too many minds? He's there. Mind the sword, mind the enemy, mind the people watching, too many minds. That's a really good example of what they mean by just let the mind come down. Okay, and in yoga, what you're taught, you have 8 steps in yoga. You have the do's and don'ts, like the 10 commandments. Then you have asana, which is posture. So you learn how to get your right posture if you want to breathe. And anyone who's done BJJ knows that when you've been stacked and the pressure's on, you can't breathe. Okay, so there's a perfect example of why posture is important to breathe. And in yoga, when you're talking about meditating, I'm not talking about 10, 20, 30 minutes, but I'm talking about the ability to meditate 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 hours unbroken. You need good posture to be able to do that. And then the breath. And the breath is the start. In Indian yoga, pranayama is what is commonly called breath control, but prana is life force, ki, chi, that's what, and yam is control. Okay, so breathing is what connects the body and the mind, the body and the spirit and the soul. It's through breathing that we gain control of the mind. And that's why in karate it's really important. I don't think we do enough of it. Ibuki, Nogare 1, Nogare 2. These breath methods, if they're taught properly, give us an opportunity to learn how to control the mind under pressure in normally fearful situations. But as you know, Sensei, there is no such thing as Kyokushin or Goju or Shotokan. It's just karate minus a, of course. And once again, there's only one martial art. There's only one fighting system. And Goju, Shotokan, even Shotokan was a creation to, in one way or another, separate, create a Japanese version of the Okinawan karate. So you're 100% right. At the end of the day, if you got 10 good men from Goju, 10 good men from Shotokan, 10 good men from Kyokushin, 10 good men from Shitoryu, 10 good men from Wadoryu, and got them in a room together, you'd find more similarities than differences. Even if the techniques are slightly different, the mindset behind them are very much in accord. Us, thanks, yeah. Thank you for a brilliant answer. Okay, Us, good on you, man. Thanks for coming, Ryan. Okay, so we might wind it up there. Just a few good questions there. Appreciate that very much. We just thought we'd do a question and answer, and we got some good questions. I hope that's useful, and we look forward to doing this again sometime. If you have more questions, by all means, put them underneath. Leave a message. If you haven't subscribed, I don't know why. You're one of 2 or 3 people in the world who haven't subscribed to our channel. But if you have subscribed, by all means, hit the bell and get the word out. If you think we have anything interesting to offer, even if we're just a couple of ugly blokes who sit there chatting with each other, by all means, pass the word out. Feel free to cut and paste and pass it on to your friends, because the more, the merrier. And that's what we want to do, is we want to share what we have with as many people as possible. Thanks, Todd. Good to see you, man. And Ryan, thanks for coming. Mike, reminds me of that class I had at Margaret Street back in the dojo in the early days, about 87 or 88. I looked around the room one day and we used to get big classes, 45, 50, 55 at a time. And this one night, there were so many Marks and Mikes that just for a joke, I said, has everyone met? That's Mark, Mike, Mick, Michael, Mick, Mark, Mike, Mick, Mark. And this went on. There were about 20 Marks and Mikes and Micks. But anyway, good to see you, Mike. Mark, Thanks very much. Good on you guys. Thanks, Mitch.
Well, Shihan,
Appreciate
thank you.
it.
Appreciate it.
Look forward to seeing you next week, and train well. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Us.